Hello, and welcome to a podcast on John Locke and populism. This will be a modern debate on liberal democracy. So, there will be four speakers today, including myself, and we'll each touch upon different parts of Locke and populism. So, Simon Betancur, will be starting off with Locke's kind of general political philosophy and how it relates to populism. Speaker two, Emilia, will be talking about populist challenges to liberal democracy and Locke's model. Speaker three, Victorien will be talking about Locke's views, kind of more specifically on property, freedom, and the economic situations that are caused by that can be caused by populism. And speaker four, the last speaker, Nathan, will be talking about the future of liberal democracy, if it will be reformed, replaced, or how that will look. So I'm going to start off on exploring Locke's political philosophy, his ideas on government, freedom, and power, and how they relate to a rise of modern populism. So Locke is often called the father of liberalism, based on his theories of natural rights, government by consent, and limited power, and they've really shaped modern democracy. But it's controversial whether his vision is still held up in today's political climate, especially with the rise of populist movements challenging like liberal democratic institutions. So we're going to dive into those ideas today. Locke's political philosophy was largely due to the absolute monarchy of his time in 17th century England. So he rejected the idea that rulers had power or came to power from divine right or hereditary succession. So, like getting it from their family or it being passed down. Instead, Locke wrote in his book two treatises that absolute power, quote, leads to disorder, rebellion, and tyranny. So his critique aligns surprisingly well with many modern populist arguments against elite power. So populist leaders today, whether on the left or right, often frame their movements as a rebellion against out-of-touch political class or elites, because they believe that they don't truly represent the people. So Locke argued that political power is not personal or hereditary, but it must come from the people, and it must be based on the right to make laws that regulate and protect their property. So this is a key liberal idea, but it also connects to populist demands for government that prioritize the will of the people over elite institutions or elite groups of people. So this is where the state of nature and like Locke's social contract come in. So Locke introduces the idea of a state of nature, which is a world where people are free and equal, but without a central authority to really enforce justice or enforce laws. So he describes this as, quote, a state of perfect freedom where individuals have natural rights to life, liberty, and property. But within this state, there are also problems because there is no neutral or central judge to settle disputes, potentially leading to conflict. So a social contract can help with this because people agree to form a government to protect their rights, but crucially, this government must be based on consent. So if a government stops serving the people, it will lose its legitimacy. So this idea is central to liberal democracy, but is also used by populists who argue that modern governments have kind of gone away from truly representing the people's interests and only their own or the elite's interests. So many populist movements claim that today's representative democracies have been captured by these elites and that they no longer reflect the general will of the people. But Locke warns against centralizing too much power. While he values majority rule, he also distrusts concentrated state authority. So this is a concern that is seen in many populist critiques of the modern bureaucratic state and how it functions. So he saw constitutional limits as essential to preventing government overreach and preventing the governments from having too much power and having a check on that through based laws in constitutions. So Locke's one of the biggest tensions between Locke and modern populism is who speaks for the people. So Locke believed that government legitimacy comes from the people's consent, but he also saw the need for stable institutions to enforce laws and protect rights. So this can be seen in the modern day with things like police or military. So many populists, however, tend to bypass institutions in favor of direct leadership. So, for example, Locke warned against unchecked rulers, but many populist leaders today argue that they alone truly represent the people, which can sometimes lead to authoritarian tendencies or altogether authoritarian regimes. So Locke would likely support some populist critiques of elite power, but reject the idea of leaders who claim absolute authority in the name of the people. So, in fact, he explicitly criticizes monarchs who rule arbitrarily, saying that they are still in the state of nature, they are above the law rather than bound by it. So, this raises an important question if populism can actually restore government by consent, or does it replace one form of elite power to another form, and that form is just masking it as populism when it is really the same. So this leads us to Locke's relevance today. How do Locke's ideas hold up in the face of modern populism? So on one hand, his emphasis on natural rights, equality, consent, they all fit well with populist demands for more direct representation and more accountability of the government. But many populists argue that governments today no longer reflect the people's interests, whether due to corporate influence like money, globalization, which is having to base their decisions and laws based on other countries and how they interact with the state instead of just the state itself, or also bureaucratic inefficiencies within that state, making a government incapable of kind of functioning correctly. But on the other hand, Locke's political philosophy is also deeply institutional. So he believes that laws, courts, and checks and balances on power are necessary to protect individual freedoms. So in contrast, many populists see institutions as obstacles rather than something that protects the people. But another big question is whether liberal democracy based on Locke's model is still the best system for political stability. So if governments are losing legitimacy, is it because they have gone too far away from Locke's main principles, or is it because Locke's main principles were outdated and inefficient to begin with? So should we return to a more decentralized and accountable government, or do we need a whole new form of governing altogether? So we'll discuss those more, and we'll discuss those later in the discussion. But to summarize, Locke rejected absolute power, arguing that governments must be based on consent and limited authority. His social contract theory explains why people form governments, but also why they might reject them if they fail to serve the people. And Locke's ideas resonate with populist critiques of elite power, but they also clash with them because they believe that they undermine institutions and checks on power. So, and finally, does Locke's model of liberal democracy still work, or do we kind of need to rethink it? So with that, I'm going to pass it on to the next speaker, who will explore populism challenges and liberal democracy.
The rise of populism is largely a response to frustration with elitism in government. Many citizens feel that politicians and bureaucrats are disconnected from everyday struggles, inefficient in governance, and unresponsive to public concerns. Populist leaders use this discontent to position themselves as representatives of the people, challenging established elites and political institutions. This creates tension within democratic systems, as populist movements often claim to return power to the people, but sometimes do so by undermining existing democratic structures. This raises a key question. Does populism align with Locke's principle of government by consent, or does it represent a challenge to it? Locke argued that legitimate governments derive authority from the consent of the governed. In his view, governance should be a collective agreement, ensuring that authority is balanced with individual liberty. Populist movements claim to embody this principle by advocating for direct democratic action, often appealing to mass sentiment and emphasizing majority rule. However, they frequently bypass or challenge traditional institutions that Locke saw as essential for maintaining a stable and just society. This creates a paradox. While populist movements claim to empower the people, they can weaken the very democratic safeguard meant to uphold their rights. This tension, structured governance, and direct populist influence remains one of the defining conflicts in modern political systems. In two treatises, Locke described majority rule as a fundamental principle for maintaining social cohesion. He argued that a functioning society must be bound by the will of majority, as collective decision-making is necessary for rule. However, he also emphasized that governance must be structured and protected from volatile shifts in public opinion. Without institutional safeguards, societies risk falling into chaos or tyranny. Populist leaders frequently claim to represent the will of the majority, but this can sometimes lead to the erosion of democratic norms other than their reinforcement. Populist movements use emotionally charged language and claim to represent the people. However, they can weaken the institutional checks that prevent too much power from being concentrated in one place. This raises an important question. Does populist governments truly fit with Locke's idea of a well-structured political system, or does it misinterpret his notion of majority rule? Locke was a strong critic of absolute power. As seen in his discussion on monarchy in his work Two Treatises, he warned against concentrated authority, whether held by a king or an elite ruling class, arguing that any form of unchecked power threatened individuals' liberties. This presents another challenge when examining populism. While populist movements aim to dismantle elite control, they can sometimes lead to new forms of authoritarianism if leaders consolidate power rather than dispersing it. Throughout history, certain populist leaders have systematically undermined the independence of the judiciary, eroded the powers of the legislative bodies, and flouted constitutional boundaries, all in the name of championing the will of the people. This often resulted in a gradual shift away from the democratic principles, as these leaders sought to consolidate their influence by portraying themselves as the true voices of populists, while diminishing the checks and balances that are vital for a functioning democracy. Such actions directly contradict Locke's belief that a political authority must always remain accountable and subject to revocation by the governed. This dilemma is that while elite governance can be disconnected from public concerns, unchecked populism can result in the concentration of power in the hands of a few charismatic leaders, replicating the very problem it seeks to solve. In the article, Locke, Contrast in Context, written by Eric Mack, he mentions how Richard Ashcraft argues that Locke's second treatise was a direct response to the pressing political challenges of his era. This viewpoint leads us to think about whether we should re-examine Locke's political philosophy. These ideas were shaped by the event of the 17th century and may need to be updated for today's rise in populism. Supporters of populism believe it aligns with Locke's democratic ideas by giving power to the majority and making their voices heard in politics. On the other hand, critics warn that populism poses a significant threat to the stability of the institutions that are essential for maintaining social order and safeguarding individual freedoms. This complex debate raises an important question. Should we update Locke's key ideas to fit with today's political movement, or should we view his insight as a warning about the risk and extremes of populism? Locke's political philosophy continues to be highly relevant in discussions about democracy and governance. While populist movements express valid concerns regarding elitism and government inefficiency, any proposed solution should not jeopardize the integrity of democratic institutions. Despite its flaws, representative democracy offers a structured system for deliberation and institutional oversight, which helps prevent hasty decision-making and protects the rights of minority groups. The ongoing challenge is to find a balance between being responsive to public grievances and maintaining the legal and institutional framework that uphold democracy. The debate over populism and democracy ultimately comes down to a question of balance. How can democratic systems address public dissatisfaction while maintaining the principles of representative governance? Locke's ideas provide critical guidance in navigating this challenge, offering a framework for balancing consent, authority, and institutional stability by looking at risks of having a small elite group in power and the potential problems of populist rule. His philosophy clarifies the complexities of today's political movements and changing nature of democratic governance.
John Locke's political philosophy has played a crucial role in shaping modern liberal democracies, particularly his views on property as an extension of individual labor and the dangers posed by unchecked economic inequalities. His work in the two treatises of government offer a foundation for understanding how economic structures impact political stability and governance. Locke argues that property rights emerge from labor, but he also warns that excessive accumulation of wealth can also lead to social and political instability. These ideas remain relevant in contemporary discussions about economic justice, democracy, and populism. By analyzing Locke's arguments, we can gain insight how economic fairness contributes to political legitimacy and how populists use economic grievances to challenge liberal institutions. In two treatises, 25-26, Locke presents his labor theory of property, arguing that ownership is justified when an individual exerts labor upon resources. This principle underpins the idea that personal effort entitles individuals to the fruits of the work, forming the basics for economic justice and social stability. This was a radical departure from earlier notions of property based on divine right or inheritance. Locke's views support meritocracy, where wealth is tied to one's contribution rather than social class or privilege. However, this principle has a broader implication in modern economic debates. This argument is often used to critique wealth disparities, particularly when elites accumulate vast resources without direct labor contributions. The tensions between labor and wealth accumulation is central to the economic justice movements. Many populist leaders from the 19th century to today argue that economic systems have been corrupted by those who profit without labor, violating the fairness principle Locke outlines. This critique appears in calls for higher wages, reforms, and opposition to monopolies, all of which reflects concerns about ensuring that economic reward align with actual work. Locke does not advocate for unlimited property right. In two treatises, 286, 287, 299, and 302, he warns that excessive accumulation of wealth can create instability. His theory suggests that a natural limit exists. Property should not be hoarded beyond what can be used productively, while money complicates this by allowing accumulation without spoilage. Locke still implies that wealth concentrates can be dangerous if it leads to significant inequality. This argument in particular is relevant in modern economies where wealth is often concentrated in the hands of the few. Throughout history, extreme economic inequalities has led to political unrest such as financial crisis of the 20th and 21st century, which triggered widespread dissatisfaction with liberal economic policies. Locke's concern about concentrated wealth aligns with modern regulatory discussions, including antitrust laws and wealth tax aimed at maintaining economic balances. Furthermore, Locke's warning about unchecked accumulation is central to the populist rhetoric. Economic elites are often portrayed as violating the natural order by amassing disproportionate wealth at the expense of ordinary workers. The participation fuels movements advocating for redistribution policies, stronger labor protection, and restrictions on corporate influence in politics. Locke's philosophy suggests that economic fairness is crucial to maintain political legitimacy when wealth disparities become extreme. Public confidence in government erodes. In two treatises, he emphasizes that just government must secure in not only individual rights, but also economic conditions that prevent instability. History supports this idea. Society with severe economic divides are often experiencing political upheaval, for example, the economic condition leading to the French Revolution and labor movement of the 19th and 20th century, and the financial crisis of the recent decades illustrate how economies' grievances can undermine governments. Locke's view implies that a government legitimacy depends on addressing economic injustices before it leads to mass discontent. Modern populist movement exploits this dynamic. They argue that traditional liberal institutions have failed to address economic suffering, using discontent to justify radical reforms or authoritarian measures. Locke's framework suggests that democracies must be implemented policies that balance economic opportunity with fairness and maintain stability. Populism often arises as a response to perceived economic injustices, posing itself as a corrective force against liberal policies that seem to favor elites. These movements leverage economic struggles to gain support, challenging the very foundation of Locke's liberal order. Locke's philosophy offers a potential solution. He argues that governments must ensure economies conditions that allow to have a fair property distribution while protecting individual rights. This does not mean advocating for absolute economic equality, but rather establishing safeguards to prevent extreme disparities that threaten social cohesion. One way to interpret Locke's solution in modern terms is through policies that promote equitable economic precipitation, such as progressive taxation, labor protection, and anti monopoly regulation. These measures align with Locke's vision of a balanced economy system that preserve both property rights and social stability by addressing economic grievances through legal and institutional reforms. Democracies can counteract populist narratives that claim the system is inherently unjust. Locke emphasis on the consent of the government also suggests that political leaders must be responsive to the economic concerns. If economy's hardship becomes widespread, the, the legitimacy of the government is at risk. In the sense of addressing economic inequality is just not a moral obligation, but a political necessary to sustain democratic governance. By applying Locke's principle, modern governments can work towards a system that supports both economic freedoms and social justices by preventing the kind of instability that fuels populist movements. His insight remains a powerful tool for understanding and addressing economic problems that shape our political landscape.
Today, we're going to be diving more into John Locke's liberalism and its role in economic stability, governance, and the challenges it faces in the modern era. So, one question someone might have would be, is Locke's model of liberalism the best way to ensure economic stability? Well, Locke argued in two treatises of government that private property, which is protected by government, is the key to prosperity. He wrote that the reason why men enter into society is the preservation of their property in two treatises. His idea that property comes from labor and should be safeguarded really aligns with capitalist economies, where free enterprises drives growth. But does that mean economic stability is guaranteed? Not exactly. One of the core assumptions of Locke's economic vision is that market functions best when individuals are free to pursue their interests. However, in Locke's in context by Thompson, he highlights that Locke's views developed in a time when the economy was transitioning from feudalism to early capitalism. Today's globalized economy is far more complex, and property rights alone may not be sufficient to assure stability. Economic downturns, wealth concentration, and technological disruptions challenge the assumption that liberal markets left to themselves will always produce fair outcomes. Locke's frameworks do support prosperity, but it really requires additional safeguards to prevent unchecked inequality. Now, talking about government, Locke's social contract isn't just about democracy, it's about legitimacy. In 2 treatises of government, he suggests that as long as people consent, different forms of government can exist. This means that while liberal democracy is the most common interpretation of his ideas, other systems, such as a constitutional monarchy, can still align with these principles. What's the key element, one might ask? Government must serve the people and remain accountable. If it fails, then it must change. But what does that really mean? Locke is often portrayed as a strict advocate for democracy, but it seems like he was more concerned with legitimacy than any form of single government. Locke's contract, in context, argues that his social contract theory provides justification for systemic reform rather than outright revolution unless the government becomes fundamentally oppressive. This means that democratic institutions must remain adaptable. This is an idea that's highly relevant in today's political landscape. But how would change even happen? This is where contractarianism would come in. It's a legal side, constitutional contractarianism, which focuses on laws and institutions. On a philosophical note, it would ask, what makes government legitimate in the first place? Locke leans towards real-world reform. If democracy stops working for the people, it must adapt. And this brings us to another pressing question. Can liberal democracy handle modern populism? For more context, populism has surged in the 21st century, with leaders and movements challenging traditional liberal democratic norms. Many argue that this is a failure of democracy itself, but really is it? According to Locke's principles, populism is a system of government failing to reflect the will of the people. However, Locke's contract in context warns that populism can also become a threat to democracy if it turns into a majoritarian rule that disregards minority rights. So how should a liberal democracy change? Locke's theory suggests that instead of abandoning democracy, we should refine its institutions to better address economic grievances and political discontentment. In a sense, he provides a kind of map or a roadmap, which is that reform is better than replacement. However, this requires a willingness to engage in kind of difficult conversations about wealth distribution, representation, and systemic accountability. And it's not really totally accurate in governments where there's a certain level of oppression. So how do we see Locke's vision in the world today? Elections, referendums, and political accountability reflect his idea that government must be based on consent. While political polarization, economic disparity, and distrust in institutions suggest that democracy is struggling to live up to its ideals, countries with strong democratic traditions, such as the UK, United States, and a lot of different parts of Europe, still operate under Locke's fundamental principles. What would Locke say about today's world? That's a difficult question, but more likely than not, he would argue that democracy is still about rigid adherence is not still about rigid adherence to old structures, but rather preserving legitimacy. If institutions fail to meet the people's needs, they must be reformed. Locke's liberation does definitely offer a strong foundation, but it's certainly not the finished product. Economic stability, government legitimacy, and democracy's future, really, all depend on what we're willing to adapt and when we're willing to adapt.